you can see what happens between 2008 and 2013 when the Grecian formula runs out. I decided after I retired that I could go natural, and that includes not wearing a tie. No, it's no disgrace intended, but this I was told by Bob that this was informal, so I decided to be informal. My parents were both teachers and educators, and I grew up in a house where learning was just kind of expected. It was just part of the DNA. And what I got from my parents was a lifelong love for learning, and also a lifelong love of teaching. I think that a teacher, actually, if you really want to learn something well, the best way to do so is to teach it, because in teaching you learn. And it's really, teaching and learning is just kind of two ends of a connected rod, where the teacher knows a little bit more than the learner. But the teacher is actually also constantly learning from the interaction and the interchange of the learner. And in 2001, I was asked to give a talk about education and about orthopedic education in the 21st century. And I gave a talk that was entitled, what do I press for going forward? The arrow to the right, okay. I gave a talk at Hopkins, the Grand Rounds at Hopkins, and I gave that talk at several other places around the country, and at one of Seth Greenwald's course on CCJR. That was a prediction of orthopedics in 2011. Now that talk included orthopedic practice management, and also the practice of orthopedics, how that would change over the next decade. And that talk was entitled Orthopedics 2011, A Future So Bright You'll Need Sunglasses. And I just want to start this few minutes with you with some of the things that I predicted 13 years ago, and to see where they actually have come to fruition, and also some of the premises which I don't think have really changed about how people learn, and how the process of how people learn and the application of how people learn have really kind of come together as the technology has made some of those requirements actually readily available. So the title of the talk was, what would your practice be like in 2011 in terms of practice management, continuing education, and new treatments? And I'm going to ignore practice management and new treatments because this was a longer term Grand Rounds and that's not the subject. So I'm just going to concentrate on continuing education. How do people learn? People learn in little bits of information, just little bits of information. And you know this now. Let's say, for example, that you want to know how old Dolly Parton is. Well, you know, in 2000, that wouldn't be all that easy. Now I say, Siri, how old is Dolly Parton? And she says, well, let me think about that. Dolly Parton is 68. Boom, just like that. That's a little bit of information. That's actually how people learn. That's how people used to learn. That's how people learn, and that's how people will learn. They learn in little bits and chunks of information. And this is the key concept. How do they learn best? When do they learn best? They learn best when what they're learning they need to know. What they're learning they need to know. They have a problem they need to solve. I've got a thing that doesn't work in my house. I don't read the instruction manual before I plug that thing in. I go to the instruction manual when something doesn't work and I need to know how it works. So people learn at the moment of need. What I'm going to suggest to you is that we aren't doing this in very large extent with our residents and our trainees. We're not teaching them at their moment of need. We're teaching them when it's convenient for us to teach them. We're teaching them in a, I mean, this is a prime example, this talk. You're not going to remember very much about this talk if this talk doesn't resonate with something that you're interested in learning. You're here because you're members of this society and I'm the presidential guest speaker and you're respectful of that. But if what I'm saying isn't of particular interest and need to you, then you won't remember very much about what I'm saying. Now the advantage is, however, that this material is all available on the internet. So you might say, hey, I remember something that Dr. Hungerford said. What was that? And that will be your moment of need and you'll be able to find it because we've evolved to the point where most of what you need to know is available when you want to know it. Didactic lectures. You go to meetings, you go to the academy, you sit in on a didactic lecture. The fact of the matter is that the 24-hour retention from a didactic lecture is single digits. It's somewhere between 5 and 10%. 7's a nice number. 7% of what you are presented with in a didactic lecture, you will remember 24 hours later. And how about a week later or a month later? Probably almost nothing. However, if you review it one time, that retention goes up to 40%. So if you go to a lecture, you hear something that's interesting, and then a moment of need presents itself at some time, and you go back and review it, you will remember that. In the mid-'80s, I became interested in electronic medical record, and I ended up spending about $250,000 on developing an electronic medical record that never had 1 second of use. Not 1 second of use. I bought a $180,000 file server, no, $140,000 file server, 880 megabyte file server that was the size of this podium, had to be in an air-conditioned, controlled, heated room, humidity control, with a monitor where it's a signal, 880 megabytes. Your cell phone's got gigabytes. You've got thumb drives that have 64 gigs of memory. This is an 880 megabyte file server. Unbelievable. It's just what technology has come to. And so that was a failed effort, and a lot of effort and time went into it. But I became interested in online learning. We developed a website in the 90s called aboutjoints.com. It's still up, still got a lot of interesting content on it. And Gloria Geary was a former school teacher, and she was chairman of the Online Learning Conference in 1998. In 1998, we went to the second online learning conference. Lynn Jones and I, director of my laboratory at Hopkins, went to that, the second meeting. There were 1,500 people there. In 1999, we went to the third, and there were 5,000 people there. So this was a huge growth. And she said something that I think is really critical to education. We want people to perform on the basis of what is known, not on the basis of what they know. Now, you can't know everything that is known. You don't have to. All you have to do is be able to find what is known when you need to know what is known. That's the moment of need. And what's the requirement for that? You got to have easy access to what is known. And the obstacles in 2001 were access speed, file size, particularly video. Anybody look at YouTube recently? You can upload all the YouTubes you want, free, and people can download them. You can see them on your smartphone, anywhere you want to go. And the existing knowledge database, all of these obstacles have been solved. All of these obstacles, anything you want to know. One of the problems is, of course, for you as orthopedic surgeons, is that your patients have access to all that information too, but they don't have the knowledge base to interpret it. And that's a problem. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. The orthopedic knowledge, high-speed access and media-rich data, that was a problem in 2001, is completely off the table in 2014. CME, continuing medical education. It's not attending a course. It's being a continuous learner. It's asking continuous questions, getting continuous answers, having continuous feedback. Education is not the filling of a pail, but the lighting of a fire. What is the goal of education? It's acquaintance with facts or truths. That's actually I use Apple and Keystone. I've translated that. To the left of acquaintance with is supposed to be another word, which is called knowledge. Knowledge is the acquaintance with facts or truths or data, information. But wisdom is the ability to use knowledge and experience to make good choices. And how is that transmitted? How is knowledge converted to wisdom? That's the key. And that's what I think that we are not doing as good a job as we could do as educators. And it really doesn't make any difference. Whether you're in an academic center or not, you're educating your patients with every contact. You are educators. Unfortunately, one of the aspects of the internet is that you are re-educating your patients because your patients are already educating themselves. When they come into your office, they've already got a lot of information, and a lot of it is false. Let me tell you what I think that everyone in this room needs to consider doing, and that is creating your own informational database that you can refer your patients to, that you have personally. You don't have to create this stuff. All you gotta do is create the links to it. So you have a patient who comes in, needs a total hip replacement. They say, well, what kind of total hip replacement are you going to do, doctor? And they want you to justify your selection of prosthesis. So on my website, I have a little article in which I explain why I use the prosthesis that I use and why that doesn't necessarily make somebody else's prosthesis bad. And 83% of the patients I saw, because we did this survey, have access to the internet. And so I don't sit there and explain to them. I give them the link and say, here's where you can do it. And if you want to do it now, here's a computer you can do it. I'm not going to spend a lot of time re-educating the patient, but I am going to tell them, I know what I'm talking about, and here's where you can read about it, and then if you have any questions, I'll answer your questions. But I'm not going to spend a lot of time re-educating their misinformation. And they come in with crazy stuff. You know, I have patients call me up when we had you remember when the MIS was the big buzzword, minimally invasive? I had patients call up. Well, I've got a whole talk on minimally invasive surgery. I had patients call up and say, well, does Dr. Hungerford do this new minimally invasive total knee replacement? And initially, my secretary said, well, what should I tell them? And finally, I thought about it for a while, and I said, tell them yes. Dr. Hungerford always does minimally invasive. So they come in and they say, well, Dr. Hungerford, your secretary tells me that you do minimally invasive total knee replacement. And I say, well, that depends on your definition of minimal. And they say, well, what do you mean by that? I said, well, Webster's has two definitions. Definition A and definition B. And definition A is the least necessary. And definition B is barely adequate. So which one would you like? I say, I've been doing minimally invasive surgery for my whole life. I invented minimally invasive surgery in 1972. So, you know, sometimes you got to stretch the truth a little bit. I don't do minimally invasive by the definition of the people who are doing minimally invasive, and I'm happy to say that minimally invasive has kind of disappeared as a buzzword. How does one transform knowledge into wisdom? It's by interaction. So you see, what we have here, if you and I could sit down and talk about education, that would be the kind of interaction that would take place. But that's not what's happening here. This is a one-way street. And unfortunately, you see, that's a lot of what if you're in a department of orthopedic surgery, a lot of what passes for orthopedic education is one-way communication. For many years, I've been retired from Hopkins, and we have a new chief, and there are a lot of changes that are taking place. But at Hopkins, for decades, we had a curriculum that consisted of covering the spectrum of orthopedics in a 2-year cycle. And that consisted of a didactic lecture by an expert in the field, and maybe a little discussion afterwards. Let's say I would come down every second year and I would give a grand rounds on total knee replacement. And all the residents were required to come. Well, let's take a look at that for a second. This resident sitting here is on the hand service. How does that meet his moment of need? This is on the fracture service. He's on pediatric orthopedics. He's on spine. These three guys here are with me at the Good Samaritan Hospital for 10 weeks. How much do they need to know from this lecture that I'm giving them? Nothing. How much is going to sink in from these guys who are sitting here? Nothing. What am I doing there? Wasting my time, wasting their time. That's what passes for orthopedic education. Now, anything that I present in a didactic session is something they can get online, and they should bring that to. They should bring that to the time we spend together, which is interactive, in which we say, okay, here's Mrs. Jones. These are her configurations. How would you attack this problem? And we've got some give and take in there. We are then in the process of converting knowledge into wisdom, which is the ability to use knowledge and experience to make good choices. That's what we want to do with education. We want to turn out residents. We want to take residents who don't know anything And we don't want to convert them into somebody who knows everything but doesn't know how to use it. And that takes interactivity. This is a phenomenal resource, and I think this is, I gave them this whole talk, so I don't know whether it's going to be on the website or how it's going to be, but this is a picture. Anybody who's involved in education, this is a book that should be read. This is it's the real goals of education. The real goals of education, called The Big Picture. And I've taken some things to summarize from this. What is the goal of education? We want to do what my parents did in bringing me up. They converted me to a commitment to be a lifelong learner, to be passionate about what I was doing, and to be ready to take risks. They wanted me to be able to problem solve and to think critically. You don't get that from a didactic lecture. They wanted to be able to look at things differently. Isaac Asimov said, the true phrase in science is not eureka, it's that's funny. The true phrase in science isn't eureka, I found it. The true phrase is of discovery is, that's funny, that's strange, that's bizarre. Jim Fickey gave a talk on serendipity yesterday. I highly recommend that you take a look at the word serendipity in Wikipedia. It is unbelievable how many things that you use every day came about from that's funny. Just give you one example. The inkjet printer. A guy is standing in front of a microwave with a ballpoint pen in his pocket, and his ballpoint pen explodes. And he says, that's funny. And he took that experience in that one event, and he developed the inkjet printer. That's a long story how he got there, but the seed that stimulated him was, that's funny. Cellophane. The guy's walking along, he drops a bottle of collodion on the floor, and he's wiping it up, and then he says it's not working very well, just spreading it around. He decides he let it dry. He lets it dry, he goes back, pulls up the first sheet of cellophane. That's funny. So we want our learners to be able to see things differently, not in a routine fashion, and not necessarily in the way we see that. We want them to be able to work both independently and also with others. We want them to be creative, to care and give back to their community, to persevere, to have integrity, self-respect, moral courage, and to be able to use the world around them well. That's the goal of our educational experience. And we want them to love what they're doing and enjoy their life and their work. Education has one basic factor, a sine qua non. George Woodbury from the 19th century educator, philosopher, said, you must want it. If a person doesn't want to be there, I don't want them to be there. They're just taking up space. Somehow, we have to be creative in the educational experience and get people to want to be there. Learning it's got a purpose, it's got a goal. What are we trying to get out of it? People are doing this now. What's your objective? Participation is voluntary. I think and participation should be active, not passive. Now, there are roles for, there's a time and a place for a didactic lecture, yes. But I think in some ways, we don't require enough of our learners. I'm doing a total hip replacement. I got a PG2 resident there. He knows he's not going to do this. But you know, when I ask him, what's that muscle? And I'm pointing to the gluteus maximus, and he says it's the psoas. I want him out. I don't want him there. How can he come into my operating room and not know basic human anatomy for that case? It's available. We put on our website a 2-hour anatomy of the hip video in chunks. You want to know where the sciatic nerve goes? You want to know where the femoral nerve goes? You want to know osteology? You want to know where any of the muscles go? It's in 1 to 4 minute chunks. Boom, boom, boom. There, plays. How can you go? How can we tolerate that a resident comes to the interactive of surgical rounds, bedside, and knows nothing, no preparation? We don't require enough of them. They should be kicked out. And I've kicked residents out of the operating room. I've said, okay, you don't know enough to be here. I'm not spending my time teaching you basic anatomy during this case. Don't have enough time for that. You go, we'll get a scrub tech to take your place. You go to the library and you learn the anatomy of the hip, and don't come back for the next case if you don't know anything. I don't care if they're going into hand or trauma or sports or spine and they're not interested in being there. They better at least fake interest. Opportunities for reflection should be, teaching and learning is problem solving. That's what we want. We want teaching and learning is solving problems. And I can tell you the best way that I did, every week I had an hour with the residents, 3 guys and me. And 50% of it was me talking and 50% of it was them talking. Those were, as far as I was concerned, the best educational experiences. That is the best teaching that I ever did, was in those sessions. And I think we should have more of them. Teachers and learners solving problems together. So I think that orthopedics in 2024 is a future so bright you'll need sunglasses. Now, the only problem is we got to get Medicare to help out a little bit here, because there's a lot about medicine that's, I'm kind of in some ways glad I'm retired, in other ways not. But as far as education is concerned, as far as learning is concerned, man, it's just, the technology has just come up to where it can do all the things that we want to do. Thank you very much.